For those who aren't familiar with our work, the Alliance is a coalition of community-based organizations and advocacy groups building shared power to advance strategic campaigns around the intersections of racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and health equity. Our mission is to advance justice and equity and economic growth and land development in the Twin Cities. And for many years, the Actualizing Equity event series has continued to create space for community organizers and aligned stakeholders to build relationships, share knowledge, and strategize together in our work to change the policies and systems that influence racial, economic, environmental, and health equity in the Twin Cities region. And so today, as we are near the end of the first month of the 2022 legislative session, we are going to be discussing housing justice at the state level. And as many of the folks on this call know too well, an epidemic of housing injustice has targeted communities of color for generations. But the COVID pandemic and the resulting statewide eviction moratorium created broader public attention and targeted policymaking at all levels of government to protect the life and dignity of our neighbors who do not own their homes. Recognizing the critical role of state legislators and leaders in not just mitigating the harm of this pandemic moment, but uprooting entrenched inequities for long-term systemic change. Equity in Place and a coalition that the Alliance staffs has identified key priorities for housing policy during the current 2022 legislative session. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Owen Duckworth, who is the Director of Organizing and Policy.
Thanks, Carolyn. Again, as Carolyn mentioned, my name is Owen Duckworth. I'm Director of Organizing and Policy at the Alliance. Yeah, I'll be moderating the panel here, and I'll be sort of kicking us off by sharing a little bit about Equity in Place, who we are as a coalition, why we're doing work at a state level and at the state legislature in particular, and why we've built sort of this policy agenda. And then, of course, we'll be hearing from our panelists here, and who will be talking about some of what's happening on the ground, some of why we have some of the policy priorities we do, and some of the sort of narrative approaches, narrative shifts that we hope to see in the world and in our work that can move us along the path towards accomplishing some of these. So I'll start by describing a little bit about Equity in Place, who we are as a coalition. So Equity in Place is a coalition that's a mix. We sort of describe it usually as a set of partners that's a mix of community-based organizations from across different cultural and geographic communities around the region, mostly in Black, Indigenous, and people of color neighborhoods and communities, and as well as housing advocacy organizations, research organizations who all are working to advance housing justice and racial justice in the context of housing, as well as really community development. So the Alliance has been a co-convener of this space for a number of years, really going back to its inception, really about 9 years or so ago now. And we have done a lot of work, again, mostly sort of regionally focused, but in recent years we've shifted to focusing increasingly at a state level, which I can sort of try to summarize here. So again, so Equity in Place, as the pandemic started as a coalition, had recognized obviously the really critical moment that it was for our housing system and for our communities. And we had been doing a lot of work to support local campaigns. We've been doing actually some work engaging Minnesota Housing Finance Agency for a couple of years and beginning to influence their qualified allocation plan, or really how, where, and to what end resources are being invested in affordable housing and in our communities through the state agency to provide for affordable housing, preserve affordable housing, et cetera. So we were already sort of paying attention to what was happening at a state level. But of course, in March 2020 and shortly thereafter, as the pandemic took hold, and in particular, a big moment for us was when Governor Walz used his peacetime emergency declaration to issue a statewide eviction moratorium. And we applauded that decision, of course, also wanted to push for additional measures, some of which happened, some of which didn't, protecting renters. But we quickly realized that the eviction moratorium was a really, really, really critical backstop in terms of protecting people under a deadly global pandemic, and of course the rolling economic impacts of that on communities. So we stepped in and really wanted to make sure that we had um, some public sort of defense of the eviction moratorium. We realized there were very powerful interests that were opposing the eviction moratorium outright or wanting to significantly weaken it. And so we really stepped in and started engaging the governor, engaging in sort of some public conversations about the importance of the eviction moratorium. That led us also into conversations with ultimately on emergency rental assistance, as that sort of began coming down through the federal government into our state. And then last legislative session in particular, when it became apparent that there was going to be what became called an off-ramp to the eviction moratorium, which was legislation that was put in place at the end of 2021 legislative session. Our coalition stepped in significantly to try to, really for the first time, doing legislative advocacy work to try to ensure that there was strong protections for, or protections really at all at that stage was what was in doubt for renters beyond the end of the eviction moratorium last summer. So hopefully that explains a little bit of how we've ended up shifting into state legislative work. This year, of course, a number of the items that people will be discussing in the panel today, and you'll see in our policy agenda, are things that actually we supported in years past, or are things that last year were also part of what was our really first attempt at a state level policy agenda, but some of which have more political possibility this year. Let's put it that way. So we are, again, really just acknowledging we're sort of new to the legislative space, but also we believe we represent sort of a different set of interests, of different perspective in terms of our housing system and in terms of our communities, as a coalition that's, again, very rooted in tenant organizing, very rooted in organizing in communities of color, very focused on racial justice in the context of how we approach our work. And traditionally, voices from our communities and voices connected to people organizing renters have not been very present in terms of outlining what are the needs of our communities, what are the needs of renters at a state level at the legislature. So wanting to shift, and I think what as we sort of do these questions, if folks on the panel, of course, could sort of introduce themselves and just share name, organization, pronoun, and then sort of as you get into your responses, maybe is the best way to do this, so we can just sort of allow folks to start talking right away. But I'll sort of start, and this first question is really around kind of grounding us. We recognize, right, we're a couple years into a global pandemic. Many of our elected leaders seem intent to move on, and we know our communities are still very much in the midst of the pandemic and its continued impact. As organizers and advocates who have been supporting tenants throughout this crisis, what are you hearing from renters in this moment that elected leaders, policymakers, and the public need to hear or need to hear more of? I'll open up to anyone on our panel, and if folks again could sort of quickly introduce themselves and share name or pronoun quickly what you do, and then we'll jump in.
Sure, I can definitely start. My name is Juan Rivera. I'm a tenant organizer with Homeline. I use he, him pronouns. And I'll pass it on to the other panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Fatima Mohammed. I am a housing organizer at African Career Education and Resource. We are an issue-based organization in the northwestern suburbs. We're based in Brooklyn Park, and we serve the northwestern suburbs of Minneapolis in areas like housing, where we build tenant power, but also in health equity, economic development, and also civic engagement.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. All right, no problem. Thanks, Fatima. Hi, my name is Max Sai. I'm a housing attorney at Housing Justice Center. Housing Justice Center is a nonprofit public interest advocacy and legal organization, and our primary mission is to preserve and expand affordable housing for low-income individuals and families.
So maybe pivoting back to you, Fatima, guessing you might want to start by taking on that question some of what you're hearing on the ground.
Sure. Well, first of all, good afternoon and peace be with you all. Assalamu alaikum. So I've been working with renters in the northwestern suburbs since June 2020, basically the entirety of the pandemic. You know, through this pandemic, our community went through a trauma of a century while already being incredibly vulnerable. Truly, I have witnessed distress like no other. I specifically remember a renter calling, you know, in the beginning of the pandemic and saying, I lost a lot of family due to COVID. We have a Section 8 voucher, but we are still unable to pay our portion of the bill because all the money we have is going to burial expenses. Can you help us with rent and utilities? Unfortunately, I had to tell her no because at the time, rental assistance only covered people who aren't getting any type of housing assistance. Fortunately, that policy changed when Rent Help MN, you know, opened, but now Rent Help is closed. And we're kind of going back to that era. You know, when Rent Help was established, it had some really positive consequences for renters. Renters were able to get caught up and reestablish their leases. For example, during the pandemic, a grandmother raising her 7-year-old grandson lost her job because her grandson's school went virtual. And she couldn't find childcare because all of those were closed. She fell behind on rent. And because she fell behind, her lease wasn't able to be renewed until she paid all her rental debts. Fortunately, Rent Help, you know, helped her pay those debts and catch up, and she renewed her lease. She no longer needs rent help, but other renters who do are still coming to, you know, ACER's office and asking to, you know, reapply their Rent Help application because they still believe it's active, but that's not the case. And unfortunately, we have to deliver that sad news that it's no longer available. But after the disappointment, they feel lied to. And I don't know what to do about that. It's really difficult because we kept telling them it ends in June, but it didn't. It ended abruptly recently. And you know, like the demographics of our community is really interesting. For like the majority of our community is children and young people. Like I know a family who is, you know, when the pandemic happened, their parents are frontline workers. So they're, for example, a janitor at a hospital. And, you know, the older children, they have college classes. And then the younger children, they are, you know, doing virtual school at home. And so the older kids are failing out of school because they're helping the younger kids go through school. And the parents are coming home, you know, with a deadly virus. And it just like, it put the whole community like back a generation, it feels like. And because our community is so young and because there's so many, you know, children and young people, essentially the pandemic, you know, it set back our entire future. And I feel like that's something that we don't talk about. Rent Help has been really helpful and it has helped a lot of those communities, but it could have been better. And yeah, we need to look at that. I'll pass it to Juan. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Yes, thank you everyone for showing up today and being present. So as a tenant organizer, working throughout the state of Minnesota, but predominantly within the Twin Cities metro area, I'm definitely seeing a lot of struggles, especially during COVID-19, just a lot of economic struggles, a lot of food insecurity through those economic struggles, and a lot of housing insecurity through those economic struggles of, like Fatima shared, you know, the largest impact other than losing specific jobs is the shift of going from virtual to physical schools. And that shift in having, you know, single parents or parents in general, my family specifically, we're a multi-generational home here. So we did have some support with grandparents in the houses, but that's not always the case there. And being within COVID, being a multi-generational household with financial struggles, with food insecurity struggles, and then also within that juggling trying to make sure everyone's staying safe during this pandemic has definitely led to a lot of physical and mental and emotional stress on tenants that I work with every single day. There are no simple answers to questions that folks have nowadays, which is very frustrating, not only for the tenant, but frustrating on our end too. Because yeah, our goal is always to keep folks housed, but unfortunately with limited resources that we have and the drastic impact that this pandemic has had on, especially on BIPOC communities within our community, it's just been a bigger lift than organizations have been able to keep up with. And in that through those tricklings, we have seen a lot of folks, ultimately suffering as a result of losing their housing, suffering food insecurity for more than weeks on end. Especially now, we live in a very extremely cold state. It's been a really cold winter this winter. Not having adequate access to housing, not having adequate housing or adequate access to clothing, to hygiene issues or hygiene resources. These are all issues that we see within housing. Housing, at least in our standpoint, it's not literally just the structure that folks live in, but what's internally in that structure as well. And we've seen those categories and those the daily livelihoods of folks drastically changed during this pandemic. And Rent Help has been a great resource in the sense of allowing folks to get some financial resources to stay up on rent and utilities and other type of services. But yeah, when the program ended in June or in January, abruptly, it was really hard to deal with these calls and to not have answers for tenants, not having real answers for tenants, and knowing that the next answers for them might not be the best. It might be a resultant of them couch surfing from family to family if they have that privilege, if they have that resource. It might mean them going to a shelter if they seem that is the best choice for them. And it might mean them staying out in the elements and braving the elements in such a cold state that we have. These are just the realities that we see every day on in the work that we do. Hotline staff at Homeline, the calls have gotten a lot longer. Calls went from 30 minutes to an hour simply because solutions, this is not as simple as they were. Solutions are a lot more complicated now. Folks have multi issues on top of issues now simply because of the environment that we're operating in. Thank you. I'll pass it on over to Max.
Thanks, Juan. So I'd like to start echoing what Owen and my co-presenters have said. And as we all know, the last 2 years have been incredibly challenging, and it just doesn't seem like it's going to get easier going forward, especially given all the certain uncertainty with events in the world. And echoing what they've said, what we at HJC Housing Justice Center are hearing from renters is similar. It's a sense that they're constantly right now on the precipice. They're on the brink of losing everything. A lot of people saying, I'm on the edge of being homeless. Like, if I can't figure something out, I don't have anywhere else to go. For many, this sense of being on the brink, being on the precipice of losing their home has been an ongoing feeling coming from a long period of not being supported by their communities, not being supported by their government, and from historic racial inequities created by the entrenched systems that we've set up over the course of decades and since the founding of this nation. But that being said, in this current moment, it's never been harder to get back on your feet if you're struggling. And that's really even more illustrated by the other types of callers that we get. For many folks, they're housing unstable directly due to this pandemic, to these recent events. Many of the renters that we have assisted over the last year with Rent Help MN have never been on any kind of government assistance before. They call us, they say, I've never had to ask for anything before, but it's just such a hard time right now. For many of these folks, they're unable to work or unable to find new work because of COVID-19. Maybe they're immunocompromised, or they have a relative that's immunocompromised, or maybe their work is not accommodating of what they need for new demands in childcare, for any number of reasons. And many of these people continue to be unable to work because, as we all know, this pandemic has not gone away. For many people, who were affected and remain affected by this ongoing pandemic, applying for COVID-19 assistance rental assistance has been essential. And then applying for rental assistance during COVID-19, and now that it doesn't exist anymore, when they applied for it, they realized that it was one of the only options, if not the only option for many people. Now that it's gone away, it's really giving a lot of people, many of them, again, unstable for the first time due to this pandemic, it's giving them a new awareness of how scarce the resources are in our state for those that are facing emergencies. I've spoken to lots of folks who have been shocked by how difficult it is to find assistance for their rent outside of Rent Help MN. And even applying for Rent Help MN was difficult for a lot of people. And for folks who are having difficulty finding assistance and getting help with their rent, that saps what little energy they may have left to attend to the other challenges that they have in their daily lives, especially during these challenging times. They're not able to balance the time that they need to call back their rent help case manager, to call back their social worker, to apply, send in 3 different forms to find all their bank information. That takes time, and many people, extremely reasonably so, are unable to balance the time that they need to get assistance with the time that they need to find a new job, interview for a new job, get all the documents that you need to be able to, apply, be able to start a new job. They're unable to balance that time to needing to attend to their assistance applications, to be able to find childcare, to be able to care for a sick family member. And that's when Rent Help MN was still open. That difficulty has only increased exponentially with the closure of Rent Help MN. So for all renters, those with ongoing challenges and those with new challenges present, at this point, over 2 years old challenges, but still challenges that are brought on by the pandemic. This scarcity and sense of panic and danger ratcheted up with the end of Rent Help MN last month. The end of Rent Help MN came suddenly, and it came in the middle of a cold winter. It came at the same time that other sources of help, income help, such as the enhanced child tax credit, stopped for those folks. On the other hand, we have, for some landlords, the end of Rent Help MN has given them a signal to return exactly to the way things were before. They're treating the end of Rent Help MN, and they're treating it like the end of the pandemic, the end of the emergency. And what folks in the government and the public need to hear is that people are feeling left behind. Right now, there's very few assistance options for people, and most of those options are not enough for what people need. And Fatima and Juan are getting these exact same calls. We're getting a lot of calls, again, from people who are saying, if I can't apply for rent help and there's no other assistance available, what am I going to do to cover March? Am I going to be out of my place by March? And these renters feel like lawmakers and public, you out there, are on the side of their landlords because they're feeling like everybody's saying, hey, let's get back to normal. But normal is no longer possible for many people after what's happened over the last 2 years. What's happening is, they're being told that this should be over, and when they see there's no help available, there's nothing to, acknowledge the fact that they're not able to get back. They're feeling like lawmakers, the public, they're on their side. They're on the side of those that want to kick them out of their homes. They're on the side of these landlords are saying, hey, flip the switch. We need to go back to the way things were before. So, in short, I just want folks who are listening today to do is let the many renters currently in crisis know, first off, that we still care about you. Second of all, that we still hear you. We still hear that you're in crisis. But most importantly, I want the people who are listening today to let the renters know, let people out there know that we're going to act.
Thank you, Fatima, Juan, and Max, for those perspectives. I mean, I think it's, some of the shared stories that you all have are super heartbreaking and really powerful. And I think we'll touch on, of course, some of the kind of the lessons and I think this perspective of kind of new normal and what does that mean? I think what you just said, Max, about people are getting this signal that we're supposed to return to a new normal, and for most people there is no normal. There is no return to a normal. So, of course, people especially highlighted the significance of rent help MN going away, and I think we'll probably continue to touch on that in other conversations. And I'm guessing there'll be some, when we get to some questions, that will also be a section that people want to touch on. I think it's obviously really one of, probably the most consequential event it feels like that's happened in our state in terms of our current situation with housing, especially for renters in crisis and need. But want to shift a little bit again to talking some about this legislative session priorities, of course, and we want to talk about rental assistance and some of the asks we're making as a coalition and with a number of partners immediately to resource rental assistance. Obviously, our policy agenda is broader than just that, and we really emphasize as well that lawmakers also must be accountable to the thousands of households that are still experiencing the impact of this pandemic, as people, as our panel's already alluded to, as well as adopt new policy approaches that move beyond some of the temporary measures, right? Some of the deeper systemic issues that, right, we say before the pandemic we had housing crises in many of our communities, right? So this is not new. So want to talk a little bit about some of those pieces that can deliver justice and equity for renters in our communities beyond the current pandemic. So I want to again pivot back to the panel and just kind of have folks share what are some of the policies that are most important to our communities and to your communities. And I'll let anybody answer, but I can also call on folks if they if a nudge is needed.
I can kick it off for sure. Yeah, so something that we're really focusing over on Homelines and is eviction reforms and eviction expungements. Eviction reform is so necessary in the state of Minnesota. The state of Minnesota is one of 4 states in all of the country that does not require, sorry, my dogs are barking. Give me 1 second. Actually, I'm gonna pass it on to another panelist in the meantime.
I can go next. So at ACER, we work deeply with, for example, Juan, who works at Homeline, but all of Homeline, right? And Homeline is really, really cool. They're really crucial for the work that we do. And one of the things they help us with is they send us lists of evictions in our area. And so we door knock, and while Rent Help was around, we would help them complete the application, and that would help them, protect them from a type of eviction. Interestingly, when there was, a state level rental assistance and other times when there was a full eviction moratorium, the eviction lists we used to get were like 2, 3, 10, like very, very minimal. And the issues used to be things that are very egregious, right? Things like drugs in the home, or very, very like big breaches of lease. But now the number of evictions that we're receiving has like increased by 5 times, and all of them are non-payment of rent. And so what that leads to is 2 types of evictions: formal and informal. So formal evictions we see. Informal evictions are canceling people's leases. And what ACER is working on, in our area, is a just cause non-renewal, where people aren't displaced in another name. Like it's an eviction by another name, basically. So just cause non-renewal is actually super simple. It's proving that the people that you're displacing have done something wrong. A lot of times they haven't done anything wrong. A lot of times it's discrimination, it's retaliation, it's how dare you say that I am not doing something correctly. And that kind of like entitlement is really dangerous. So, we are really hoping that that the ordinance we're working on in Brooklyn Center specifically passes. The people in Brooklyn Center deserve more from their representatives. Specifically, I know this one complex that has has put a family who has lived there for 11 years on a month-to-month lease, and that family every month is worried that this might be the last month in their home. And our homes aren't just four walls, they are the places during the pandemic that we did our home, that was our home that we lived in, but we did school there, and we also, some of us worked there, and it just doesn't get better, right? But other than Just Cause, we're also working on deep organizing. And so deep organizing is basically where renters come together, they learn about their rights, they build relationships with each other, and then they take those issues to their landlords, and other times they take it to the city. Well, some of these landlords are super predatory and negligent. One complex, for example, has basements that constantly flood, and it's not even a normal flood. It's sewage that's coming to the surface, and they never fix it permanently. They just remove the sewage essentially. And when renters, complain, they get a lease cancellation, a month-to-month lease, an eviction, right? Other times they don't even get any type of maintenance. Other times, renters are living in really dangerous situations. So when they come together and they go to city council and they share their grievances, they find themselves in really difficult situations where they were already vulnerable, but now they might be homeless. And so it silences people. And what we really need from policymakers is laws that actually protect organizing, where tenants feel comfortable to be able to come forward and say, this is what's happening to us, and we need solutions. But that's not available. There are obviously, right, there are some retaliation laws, but they're not enforced very well, and that really needs to change. And then lastly, I think having a source of income protection would really, really help organizers, because a lot of organizers, when they really need protection is when they're vulnerable. And so if you're a wealthy person who can just move, why would you stay in a terrible place? But the reason our the people that we work with live in the communities that they do is because they love their neighbors, they love their community, and they want to invest in it, and they want to live there for a long time. And other times it's because they're very vulnerable and they don't have the funds. So it's this mixture of deep connection to the community and financial vulnerability. So if we had when renters apply for rent help or any kind of rental assistance from the government, when that happens, landlords retaliate and they put people on month-to-month, and they put people on they cancel people's leases, sometimes they evict them, and it's all discrimination, it's all retaliation. But if we had source of income protection, there would be no such thing as, oh, we don't accept Section 8. Oh, you had rent help. Well, that means you can't pay ever, even though you got your job back. It's crazy. And so we really, really need policy makers to create policies that protect renters. Things like transparency in who your landlord is. Sometimes these landlords are hiding behind 7 different LLCs, and you don't even know who's taking your money and exploiting you. It's crazy. We also need, like I said, source of income protection. And lastly, to better enforce these laws that protect organizers. Thank you so much. I will pass it on to my colleague, Max.
Hi, all. Thank you, Fatima. So I'll talk about a couple of key policy things I wanted to highlight on the EIP agenda and things that are important. That from callers that we get at Housing Justice Center, but also important to us as policy advocates as well. And what I'll talk about today is rental assistance, additional rental assistance. What I'll talk about today is also universal vouchers. And finally, I'll echo what Fatima said and reemphasize the importance of source of income protections. And I'm talking about all 3 of these today because they're all part of a package of things that we need. They all work together. They all help enforce and strengthen. One policy helps enforce and strengthens the others. And I'll make that clear throughout my kind of presentation of these policy points. So I want to talk about rental assistance first, and this is the short-term part of the package. And rental assistance, what we need is $330 million in rental assistance. We need it as soon as possible to cover the gap between now, this moment, honestly, to cover the gap between all of this month and part of last month, but importantly, to cover the gap between now and the end of the off-ramp legislation in June, and to fulfill the promise of that off-ramp legislation and to meet the immediate needs of renters. Now, again, as we've talked about, the COVID-19 pandemic has been ongoing for over 2 years, and many of us have quickly realized that this wasn't going away anytime soon. It's gone on longer than many of us, myself included, would have guessed and hoped. You know, if you had asked me in March 2020, I would have said in June 2020, we'll go back to ordering nachos for the table. And I can tell you in February 2022, that is certainly not the case. And, you know, that's reflected in the stats. Just yesterday, MDH reported 1,075 new cases. This is ongoing. You know, despite the presence of a vaccine, there's numerous setbacks to our attempts to return to normal. There's great hesitancy around people doing the types of things that might make the pandemic end sooner. People refusing to get vaccinated, even refusing to do the bare minimum of wearing a mask. The choices that people have made and continue to make have made this a pandemic that continues from March to this day and will continue into the foreseeable future. And, you know, at minimum, I think all of us can imagine that our return to normal might take longer than June 1st of this year, which is not that far away. As been said before, and as many of you know, the state's COVID rental assistance program, Rent Help MN, ended this January. That left thousands of renters in a dire situation. We need something that fills the great need for rental assistance through these next few months. We already have, again, callers telling us, I don't know how I'm going to pay for March. I was calling, you know, Rent Help, you know, December, I was calling folks in the know, and they said that we don't know when Rent Help's going to end. I turn around in January, I find out it's ending at the end of the month. You know, I was counting on, you know, I'm still in this pandemic, I still can't find a job, or I still can't work, or I have a household member who's immunocompromised and I'm worried about bringing it back to them. You know, I was counting on being able to, because I still have a COVID impact, being able to get help with my March rent, being able to get help going forward. And now I don't know what to do. And, you know, if I don't have a rental assistance program, the off-ramp legislation means nothing to me. And that off-ramp legislation specifically protects people from what's called an eviction for non-payment of rent. If, you know, people can't put in an application, they can't be protected under the law for an eviction for non-payment of rent if they have an application for a rental assistance program like Rent Help MN, if that's not available. So if there's no emergency rental assistance to fill the gap between now and January 1st, that rental assistance through Rent Help MN was basically holding back an avalanche. It was the barrier between what we have now and an avalanche of non-payment of rent evictions. Like I said earlier in our first segment, people are not back on their feet. There, many people, countless people are in the same position, or they're in a worse position than they were at the height of the pandemic. The trade-off that policymakers have now and the public has now is this: if we don't act now, we'll pay for it years and years. We'll pay for it, our inaction, for years and years from the cascading ripple effects of this avalanche of displacements we'll have now. So the decision is basically, do we make assistance available now, or do we pay for it tenfold or more in the years to come? So the current ask for Minnesota Housing and the state is to keep their commitment to keep tenants housed through the end of the emergency, not just when they have decided to end funding. And this $330 million emergency rental assistance bill is what we've been told will keep the program running. We'll reopen the program and keep it running through the end of the eviction off-ramp June 1st. And it's essential in the short term for housing stability. And in the longer term, that brings me to my second item in this package, universal vouchers. And again, the huge need for COVID-19 rental assistance, and the need was huge, and there were many applications. It's another example that we've seen of the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbating systemic issues that were always present in our current system, as Owen has mentioned. We've seen other examples outside of housing about how COVID-19 has exacerbated problems in systems and how COVID-19 has highlighted the weaknesses in the system. We've seen supply chains, you've seen it at the grocery store, being congested due to COVID exposing the fragility of a system that we built on the widespread adoption of what's called a just-in-time model. So COVID exposed that system is actually fragile, and that's what leads to the grocery store being out of things costing more, your electronics being more expensive. We've also seen our hospitals reach critical capacity in part due to decades of cost-cutting measures. And we've seen COVID-19 highlight how we've reduced staffing and reduced capacity throughout decades. The hope is that in those cases with the supply chain in our hospitals, we'll learn from the pandemic, we'll strengthen those systems, not only for the next emergency, but because those systems were stretched at their limit, they were fragile to begin with. Similarly, the hope is that the public and our lawmakers will take what we learned from the pandemic to make a housing assistance system that works. Before the pandemic, so even before this emergency, our state's rental assistance infrastructure was similarly fragile to those examples I highlighted, because simply there just hasn't been the investment that's needed to keep our communities stably housed. And that's where universal voucher funding comes in. Funding rental support for all Minnesotans who qualify for it would be a huge step in strengthening our state's rental assistance infrastructure. Strengthening that infrastructure through additional funding is needed, so we're better prepared as a state to meet the needs of families and individuals. Rental assistance vouchers allow low-income tenants to dedicate no more than 30% of their income to housing. And for families and individuals who are paying a far greater amount of that monthly income, far greater than 30% towards rent, that's more than they or anybody can really afford and still get by. That means, if they have a voucher that makes it so they can't pay more than 30% of their income to housing, that voucher allows them to pay for their essentials. It allows them to stay in their homes. It brings them back from the brink that we were talking about earlier. Without this funding, we'll keep having the system we've always had. We'll keep having a system where 550,000 people in the state pay too much of their income towards rent, and we'll have a system without this additional funding. That'll be what it is, what's always been, where 75% of people who qualify for rent vouchers don't actually get one. And that brings me to source of income protection. So we have emergency rental assistance for the short term. We have universal voucher funding for the longer term. Neither of those work without source of income protection for many of the reasons that Fatima highlighted. Again, neither rental assistance, Fatima mentioned Section 8 vouchers. Neither vouchers don't work, for instance, Section 8, and rental assistance doesn't work if landlords don't accept them, or if landlords treat tenants differently if they receive those types of funding. Rental assistance and universal vouchers ensure that renters have the means to be able to get housing, but source of income protection protects those expanded housing options once they have the means, and protects that diversity and accessibility that's provided by the vouchers. The absence of source of income protections prevents voucher holders from being able to access affordable housing options that should be available to them. It prevents them from, as Fatima was saying, it prevents them from staying in their communities. It prevents them from moving into communities that they want to. It prevents them from being able to invest in the places they want to. It just severely limits their options if there's no source of income protection. You get those kind of things that the retaliation, you get people not being renewed on their leases for the only reason that one could think of is because they're on some sort of voucher, because they've received emergency rental assistance. So source of income protection, in short, is part of that long-term stability model. It's something we need in place to make universal vouchers and any future emergency rental assistance work, not only our current potential emergency rental assistance. In the short term, when emergencies happen, source of income protections protect renters from being denied available housing that they should be getting. In the long term, source of income protections protects people who are using vouchers from being displaced. And because they go to people who only qualify for those vouchers, Those sorts of income protections help the people that are most vulnerable in the state. So that's what I had to mention about that package of policies. You can see how they all work together and how they all strengthen each other if we can get all of them implemented. I'll pass it back to Juan.
Thank you, Max, and thank you, Fatima. And thank you, everyone, for being with me here. So where was I starting from? So I'll be talking about eviction reform and eviction expungement specifically. Over at Homeland, we've seen a lot of evictions coming up, especially recently with the ending of rent help. And why we think it's critically important, especially in the state of Minnesota. The state of Minnesota is one of 4 states in all of the country that does not require landlords to formally notify a tenant prior to filing an eviction action for non-payment of rent. Prior to 2019, 90% of all evictions in the state of Minnesota were due to non-payment of rent. This has just gotten as worse as the pandemic is ongoing. And why it's important, or why these evictions are so detrimental to tenants and renters and individuals in general, is once an eviction is filed, it appears immediately on a tenant's record before the court has even heard the case, or before the case has even been decided. That eviction is already on a tenant's record. That record stays on and is reportable by the tenant screening agencies for the next 7 years. That means it's the next 7 years that the person is going to have an eviction on their record, meaning that any chance of housing outside of the housing they previously had is going to be very, very dwindled. As when you look for new housing, the first things that folks look up is your tenant screening information, and the first thing they're going to see is an eviction on your record there. So a proposal that we've seen with House File 835 is requiring a pre-filing notice of 14 days before a formal eviction action is submitted. This would mean that it would provide tenants the opportunity to fix the problems and negotiate. So whether they're behind on rent, it would give them 14 days to either acquire those funds or create some type of payment plan with the landlord. If the issue is another type of issue, it would allow them to negotiate with the landlord to try and figure out some type of mediation in that setting to stay in their home. Or it would allow them 14 extra days to decide, hey, it's time for us to pack up and find a new housing option. The pre-filing notice would include information on how tenants can seek legal help and also seek emergency rental assistance or financial assistance. This not only would assist tenants mentally, physically, and emotionally in helping them navigate a system that is already pretty complicated, but also would save the courts time and money, meaning the courts would be less busy, landlords would be paid, hopefully through negotiations and actually engaging with the tenants and renters. And also we would avoid putting harmful marks on people's records for 7+ years to go forward. I can speak to, as a kid, I grew up in St. Paul for most of my life. I'm 23 years old now. This is 23 years of housing insecurity that we've experienced, at least just in my lifetime. My family, fortunately, has never received an evictions letter, but we have definitely chosen the option of evicting, self-evicting, simply to avoid that mark on our record. And I can speak to the challenges of that aspect of, we were lucky to have resources in the state of family where we can go and stay with them temporarily. But when we didn't have those resources, it meant not having food in our fridge for a week or two because we had to come up with rent and a security deposit. It meant not having adequate clothing for school, not having adequate supplies for a new school that I had to move to. It meant moving neighborhoods. It meant leaving friends behind. It meant leaving family behind. It meant moving to a different area within the same city, but was new to us, to where these actions are amplified even worse for folks who have an eviction on their mark, on their record there. And this is the reality that we've been living in just in my lifetime of 23 years living in the state of Minnesota, being a resident here. This is something that predates me. It predates my life, and unfortunately, it's continuing into the future now. So we need to do everything we can now to prevent folks from being evicted. And those 14 days pre-notice would allow folks not only to negotiate and hopefully become current on their rent and stay within their current housing, but also would give folks some options. It gives them the options to seek other type of housing. So it gives them the option to avoid getting that mark on their record and avoid displacing them for 7+ years. And then when evictions do happen, it's important that we have a system that is centering renters, that is actually conscious of what an eviction actually means and the actions and detrimental violence that that creates on families and individuals going forward after an eviction is filed on them. So where we would support an eviction reform process that would allow evictions reporting to be prohibited until a court judgment. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna keep going. Evictions reporting will be prohibited until a court judgment is rendered in favor of the landlord. This gives tenants the opportunity to remedy the situation prior to getting that mark on their record, but it would also order an expungement if the tenant prevails in the case, if the case is dismissed, and if the parties agree to expunge or request, or upon request of the tenant, if the case is settled and the tenant is fulfilled their terms of the agreement. And fourthly, the eviction was ordered 3 or more years ago. The court will consider an expungement if there's a change in defendant's circumstances, indicating the eviction case is no longer relevant or responsible, or the tenant is no longer responsible for those actions. This gives the judges more discretion to make reasonable decisions about when to grant an expungement. It's incredibly important for folks to get the opportunity to expunge. The expungement process right now, as it sits in the state without House File 835 present, is that it'll take 2 to 4 months for a tenant to get an expungement on their record. That's 2 to 4 months of folks dealing with housing insecurity, dealing with not being able to find adequate shelter. That's way too long of a time. A couple days is way too long of a time. 2 to 4 months is egregious. So yeah, it's just House File 835 would allow folks not only to resolve and negotiate situations that they may be having, whether it's non-payment of rent, whether it's other situations that they may be dealing with their landlord. It would allow them to resolve their situations in their community and hopefully stay in their home, but it would also allow folks to avoid that initial mark of an eviction on their record, and allow folks to get, and it would give folks more opportunities to go and find other options. And an expungement is just needed. It's just necessary in the state to give folks an opportunity to clear their record and to create a system that is actually creating housing sustainability and stability. 7 years on someone's record that is going to hamper their abilities to find other housing, it's just immoral. There's just no excuse for it. So we need to have a system that centers and that allows renters to actually engage in a system that will help them clear the record and achieve housing stability and sustainability.
Thanks again, panelists. So we've covered a lot of ground here, of course, in terms of our policy agenda ideas, and again, I think one of the threads that I think we've consistently encountered in especially since the pandemic has begun, and we talk about in equity in place context and between some of our different organizations, and certainly with decision makers on these issues as well, is really the sort of entrenched, and all of you alluded to these, right? The sort of entrenched nature of housing injustices, the sort of the perspective of a return to normal actually not being what is either possible really to begin with for most folks, but also what communities actually want, what communities actually need is not a return to the normal before the pandemic, where Juan, and appreciate you sharing your own personal story on this front too, where people and families were still oftentimes experiencing housing insecurity and housing injustices, right? So one of the things we talked about, and I want to again here, I'll highlight one example of, again, like some of the narrative shifts that we certainly use in our work that we think need to be sort of, but need to be public learnings, right? Need to be learnings that that systems, that government, that advocates certainly take on and sort of take with us, and begin to sort of use what we've learned from the pandemic. And I forgot whether it was you, Fatima, or someone else alluded to sort of, again, the learnings, the lessons from the pandemic as well. One of the things we say a lot, right, is that we've seen government respond in ways to housing instability that 2 years ago, 24 months ago, we would have not thought, we would have been told were impossible, right? The idea of a statewide eviction moratorium that would be in place for 15 plus months, that would prevent people from being evicted for non-payment of rent. And then, of course, some of the protections that have carried over since the off-ramp policy, since the ending of the eviction moratorium last year. Again, we saw that if the circumstances call for it, government can step in and say, we don't believe people should be kicked out of their homes, right? And we don't believe people should be kicked out of their homes now. We don't think they should have been during the very height of the pandemic. We don't think they should have been able to be kicked out of their homes in 2019 or before that, right? And so we really believe this idea that that eviction especially for non-payment of rent, should just be a normal thing that we have to accept in our region, in our society, is something that we have been shown we don't have to accept and we should not accept. So one example there, a similar one, honestly, is the emergency rental assistance, right? And we talk about this as well. That again, to a similar, in a different approach to this, but a similar massive government influx of resources and policy shift came into really all states in the country, but certainly in our case in Minnesota, through Rent Help MN, that again provided the resources for renters to be able to stay in their homes. Of course, those resources have run out. Of course, we feel like there is a waning in political will and political support to continue to make those investments locally and at our state level. So that's hence why we're having a lot of this current conversation. But wanting to pivot again to others on the panel, in terms of what are some of the other, either lessons that we have learned, we should be learning, that systems and government, the decision makers need to learn, and or what are some of the narratives that you see out there that we need to be pivoting, we need to be changing, we need to be approaching these issues differently. So curious, which of our panelists have any thoughts on that?
I can go first. So I think, one of the things that we've learned from the pandemic is that housing is a human right. Literally, like, how can education be a human right where we have established a K through 12 education system that's free, but you can't educate your mind freely when you're sleeping on the floor of a distant family member as a result of displacement, right? Like, instability in housing results in community instability. So if other things in our society is seen as human right, why is housing not seen as a human right? It's crucial to all of those parts, right? Families who worry about lease cancellations and evictions are unable to plan for their education. Like Juan said, every time your family moves from one school to another school, this disrupts education, and it endangers the ability for children to support themselves in the future. And it creates almost a cycle. Additionally, another thing that we learned from the pandemic that we've seen is that evictions are not needed. They're not, like, most evictions is literally criminalizing people for being poor. One of the main things that needs to happen is a permanent program or agency that assists renters and homeowners, because, like, housing is a human right, y'all. I really, really think that we can learn from this pandemic, that we can actually, stop criminalizing people for being poor, just help people with rent, make sure that people are paid fairly, make sure that people are having an education, that their home is stable so that they are able to pursue all those different parts in their life. Thank you so much. I will pass it to Max.
Hi, all. And the policy shift I had in mind echoes Owen's. In fact, this is the risk of not coordinating them ahead of time. But the I just want to echo, and then I'll kind of add my own things to it. Is that we in recent crises, including this one, and in recent times, we've understood that having money when there's challenging circumstances or emergencies, we have to help out businesses, we have to help out homeowners, we need to help out landlords. But there's been rental assistance, but in large part, renters are still on their own to figure it out. And up until COVID, they were even more on their own. And we all understand, through messaging, through again these perspective shifts, that this is all to stop an even greater disaster down the road. So we all understand that, having a ton of businesses go bankrupt is bad. Having a ton of homes foreclosed on or underwater to the bank is bad. We all understand that, having a lot of debt is bad in general. But what the shift I think needs to happen is having that same understanding that if we don't prevent evictions now with money, there's that same downstream, there's that same disaster down the road. We pay for it so much more if we don't step in and help with emergencies now. And I think that policy shift is more in the air now, because we've seen it happen so many times. Like Owen said, we've seen the government say that it's not possible to do X, Y, or Z, and then we've seen these huge emergency assistance bailouts to any number of sectors. And the same thing for renters needs to happen. We need to understand that a wave of evictions is so harmful, and a wave of people who are instably housed and either they can't afford their next month's rent because they've hit an emergency, or because they're paying so much more above what they're able to reasonably afford because of how expensive housing is right now, and that there's just vouchers again are not funded to the levels that they need to be, that they're always paycheck to paycheck. They're always on that precipice of not being able to make that next month, not being able to, so many people are one car issue, one medical issue away from not being able to afford their rent the next month. And once you have a pandemic thrown in there, if you don't have the infrastructure in place, you're just going to get these evictions that have this enormous societal cost, not just the cost to the person, but enormous cost to everybody. In addition to the moral case that can be made that these just shouldn't be happening in the first place. I just want to add one more policy shift that I wanted to see people making, is that we need to make sure when people are accessing assistance that there's protections in place for them, because we need to ensure that people who use vouchers to be able to be stably housed, again, with the idea that housing is a right, but also with the fact that housing stability is good for everybody. It's of course good for the renter, but it's good for the community. It's good for us as a state. It's good for us as a nation. It's important. And we need to understand that we're doing it for them, but also because they're part of our community. It's not simply just for the renter, it's for our community. And so in that, when people are using a voucher, we need to treat those people with the same dignity, respect, fairness that anybody else would get through anything else that we pay rent with, which is subsidized in all kinds of ways that we don't see. Or, what people pay their mortgage with, which is subsidized in all kinds of ways that's a policy decision to subsidize somebody's income to be able to pay their mortgage, is another form of rental subsidy. It's just one that people don't conceptualize and don't think about. And so no matter how people pay for their rent, the landlord is being made whole and should be required to treat that person the same, to not make that person feel like they're doing something where they're on the edge with their landlord, where they're feeling retaliation. They're on a month-to-month when they should be on a year-long lease like everybody else. And thanks, and I'll pass it to Juan.
Thank you, Fatima and Max, for sharing. A policy shift that I want to discuss today is that evictions are not inevitable and are a routine part of providing housing in our community. That is not the position that we should be going for. forward. As I want to echo what Fatima said, housing is a human right, and housing and add on to Max is what Max was touching on. Housing is more than just the structure itself. Housing is, where you're working, where you're going to school, where you're shopping, where you're engaging in. It's community. That's housing. Evictions are detrimental to our communities. When we're removing folks forcibly from communities, we're removing them from their homes, removing them from their neighborhoods, removing them from their friends, from family, removing them from local businesses, removing them from everything. It impacts classroom sizes, funding sizes. It impacts what your neighborhoods look like, who comprises your neighborhood, and how your community is formed. What kind of local businesses do you have in your community? Without renters, without tenants, communities would be pretty barren, barren locations. So I think challenging that narrative that evictions are inevitable is necessary. We need to change that conversation. Why are evictions inevitable? Why can there not be other forms of problem solving, of finding solutions to issues that may arise between landlords and tenants? Why is the relationship always handed over to the landlord? Why do we not acknowledge the perspective of tenants? Why do we not acknowledge the true deep impact that it truly has when folks move because of an eviction from their communities? Because all these impacts are relevant. They're true to our communities, and they have deep impacts not only on the folks that are directly being evicted, but by their neighbors and by their greater community. So yeah, just really challenging and shifting that narrative of, are evictions really inevitable? Are these really actions that are appropriate? Are these really actions that should be the status quo? These are deep questions that we need to answer. And another one, do property owners really provide necessary services and are truly focused on taking care of tenants? Are they truly focused on making sure that they're whole financially? These are conversations we need to have about. These are conversations that we need to address. These are conversations that, as a council member, as a local official, as a state official, how do you want communities to look like? What do you want them to reflect like? Do you want them to be filled with people that really don't, their interests are to fulfill their own pockets? Or do you want to have communities that are thriving because the folks that are living there and occupying these communities are truly invested in seeing these communities thrive and being a reflection of what we should be, what our goals should be, of what community should be? I live in a mobile home community here. I live very close to my neighbors, and we have a very deep sense of community here. This could be replicated from neighborhood to neighborhood, from block to block, but aren't, because there are actions that the system perpetrates that make it so that some of our neighbors are removed from areas. So I just want to challenge that narrative. Is evictions and not allowing folks to redeem themselves if they do have an eviction on their record. Are these really conversations that we want to keep perpetuating? Are these conversations we want to keep just kicking down the road? And as we kick down these conversations down the road, have deep, lasting, violent effects on people, on families, in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan and Fatima and Max. So so much wisdom shared there, so many powerful perspectives. I think, some of just want to re-highlight a couple of the narrative pieces. I think, one of the things I think we'll always say with the narrative building, narrative shifting, right? There's narratives are so powerful in the context of our world, because frequently the dominant or dominating narratives around a system, around people, around communities is one that justifies an injustice and the status quo, right? So for us as advocates, as organizers, as community members, right, we recognize the power of being able, and the truth telling that comes in building our own narratives, and also this sort of imaginative, the dreaming, the world as it can be piece of narrative building, as well as self-determination, self-empowerment, like what does it mean to come up with our own narratives in a world where especially communities of color are painted with false, damaging narratives that justify underinvestment, that justify mistreatment. Renters as a whole similarly fall into, and of course there's deep overlap of those demographics as we see in our country, in our region. So I just want to double just again couch this conversation about narratives. Probably should have said that in the front end, but just in again like why this stuff is so important, because we can begin to, when we start recognizing and engaging with policymakers, when we're able to sort of call BS basically on some of the current thinking or the current assumptions that go into justifying the status quo or maintaining the status quo. When we come with new narratives, when we come with new realities and new perspectives, we can shift what's possible very quickly. So just naming those things, I'll say, to me, yes, again, holding up the piece, housing as a human right is something I think we need to say that more often. We need decision makers to say that more often. We need decisions that reflect that. Max, you said it very well as well, that the idea of how all housing is subsidized, right? Like if you own your home, you are receiving, likely you are benefiting from the mortgage interest tax deduction, which is the largest federal housing subsidy in this country, right? But we literally use the term subsidized to refer to housing that is lower income, used by lower income people, right? Even though actually there is literally more subsidy going into middle and upper income people's housing, right? And I think just again, Juan, your point, evictions not being inevitable, right? Like that again, this is back to what was the old normal that we want to move away from, that we've seen a possibility, we've seen a year plus of existence where that was not the normal, of evictions not being inevitable, especially evictions for non-payment of rent, right? So anyways, just want to hold those things up. Want to give time now, the final 15 minutes or so we have together, assuming we want to spend all that time together, and people have questions for the panelists, or questions generally about what's been discussed today or what hasn't been discussed today.
And folks can either just come off of mute, or if you go to your reactions button, there's a raise hand function, or you can chat, put it in the chat. And I do see one question about the efficacy of eviction diversion programs, and Ivory has a great response there, but wondering if the panelists have any thoughts on eviction diversion programs as a worthwhile stepping stone or solution.
Well, I can speak a little bit to that. It certainly made a big impact in Hennepin County when Minnesota Housing put in an eviction diversion team there that was in the courtroom, that was helping with rent help and providing kind of those boots on the ground for that distribution. I can say it made a huge difference. And, as much as that kind of model can be replicated elsewhere, either if rent help is reopened and or next time that there's kind of emergency rental disbursement, I think that kind of thing really, really did help a lot of folks, and was something that was badly needed. And similarly, programs like in Hennepin County where you can get somebody to represent you, or, any other program where folks can get represented by a lawyer, that's always something that's really invaluable, because, when you already have the daunting odds with the having to go to an eviction court case, it's even more daunting when their landlords are represented and tenants are not. So any program where that can even that out is always really helpful.
Great, thanks for that, Max. Any other questions or comments, and I will catch up on the chat. So there's some discussion in the chat about essentially financially steering folks away from, it looks like condos to more quote unquote depressed houses. I wonder if folks have any thoughts on kind of financial steering or anything you've maybe experienced in your organizing that kind of relates to that.
Yeah, I'll just say it's a little tough because a lot of um um certainly I think we hear about examples of steering. We also speaking of the alliance and I think our coalition work with Equity in Place, we're less connected to sort of the process of buying or home ownership. So it's a little bit harder to address known patterns in that space, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Owen. Last call for any questions or comments, anything maybe that your organizations are working on at the state legislature this year that maybe ties into housing justice. Last call before we move to close out. Great.
Okay. Well, I can just share again a few words. Thank you to our panelists, Max, Fatima, and Juan, for sharing the stories of your organizing, the stories of some of your own experiences, and of course for all the work that you and your organizations do to advance housing justice. I'll also just say again for Equity in Place, we are going to continue to be both building relationships with legislators at the state legislature and continuing to push the Walz administration as well around what we'd like to see more urgency, especially in terms of the rental assistance piece. To be blunt, we're a little disappointed that there hasn't been more political will, more political capital expended to making this happen, given the stories that Juan and Max and Fatima all shared. And Ms. Max just put in the chat, please call the governor's office if you have a second and call your state legislator. I know there's a few staff on the call from state legislators' offices on this as well, so appreciate your attendance. But yes, please make a call. And the good thing is there is actually now in the House, a House File 3667 that is moving out of the Housing Finance and Policy Committee. That is the type of emergency rental assistance package that advocates are pushing for, us included. I can quickly share a link to that here as well. And my chat went away. But again, calls to the governor's office, calls to legislators that say, hey, we're concerned with the unavailability of rental assistance and the lack of protection for renters right now, still into the pandemic, is really important. So if that's action people want to take, of course, feel free to reach out to any of us. I guess I can't speak for all of you on this panel, but I'm guessing you would all love to hear from folks if they have questions, if they have other concerns, other things that they're seeing happening in community as well. And we are going to keep doing the advocacy and organizing work that we're going to do. So any other final thoughts from folks on the panel or Carolyn, or before we go?
I would just say that I put in the chat the link to the policy agenda and also the way to sign up for Alliance updates. And that would allow you to find out about our next Actualizing Equity events and when things like the EIP policy agenda resources are released and calls to action. So that's a way to stay in touch as well. And otherwise, I would just echo immense gratitude to Max and Fatima and Juan for spending the time with us today. So yeah, sorry, I cut off someone potentially. Any final thoughts from the panelists?
I just wanted to say thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Yay,
thank you so
thanks to
much. This was great.
everyone. Yeah, thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your Friday.